Welcome everyone this morning to this VicNoTill webinar featuring Joel Williams and Derek and Tannis Axten. VicNoTill is a not-for-profit organisation which works off its motto of farmers helping farmers. My name is Brendan Patterson, and with me this morning I have fellow board member Matt McKinlay, which will be helping out with this webinar with some questions later on this morning. Good morning, Matt, and how are you?
Morning, Brendan. Good, really good, thanks.
That's good. If anyone has any questions today, can they please type them into the Q&A section down the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them later in the session and answer as many of those as we can. Today we'll hear of Axten Farms, which is a family farm located in Southern Saskatchewan, Canada. The average annual rainfall, including snowfall, is 300 to 350 millimetres. It is 2,400 hectares in size, ranging with a diverse grain farm growing crops as spelt, peas, mustard, camellia, barley, flax, lentils, oats, black beans, spring wheat, sunflowers, rye and buckwheat. Axten Farms has recently added a new food grade seed cleaning plant to their operation, which plans to add a flour mill next. I'd like to introduce Joel first to give his little talk, which Joel is an independent plant and soil health educator. Good afternoon to you, Joel, and welcome.
Thank you, Brendan. Yep. Good afternoon, good morning to you as well. Yep. Pleasure to be back here again.
Yep. You're all right. Are you all right? Yep. And
shall I kick off, or sorry, have you still got more?
Yeah, no. If you want to kick off, you're.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you for having us again. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, and we will kick off. Okay, so the theme for today is about integrating 3 different strategies to manage crop production. I'm going to talk to begin with a little bit on the nutrition, then I'll hand over to Tanis, who will talk on biology, and lastly we'll hear from Derek with a focus on diversity through the lens of intercropping. So just to get started here, got to get my slide working. Okay. So what I'm going to do is really just kind of demonstrate the soil type of the Axtens and talk a little bit about some of their low input fertility that they use. And I put this image up here just to get started, just to give the listeners here a bit of a view of the soil that we're referring to. This was a photo that Derek just sent me earlier. They've seen some changes in their soils in the last few years, and something that perhaps will come up in the discussion time at the end. But they did have one of those classic kind of little bit of kind of platy compaction kind of layers a bit further down, which they commented to me that they've really seen has started to improve over the years since they've been applying some of the techniques and principles that we're going to talk about here today. So I put that up there just as a nice snapshot there to get going, and you can see some nice little crumb structure and nice soil color there. So moving on to, let's have a look now at the chemical profile of their soil. Now, I've got a soil test here that I'm going to share, and we're going to zoom in and just focus in on a couple of very specific things. We're not going to go through the tests in detail. I really just want to flag a couple of particular things to focus on. We will then link that into some of their kind of low input fertility strategies that they implement. So let's have a little dive in the soil in question, the case study soil today. And I'm just zooming in here. And so just the first thing to notice, you can see straight away those pHs. These are just 3 examples of their fields. You can see we have rather alkaline soils, all 8.5-ish. So of course that presents a whole range of challenges when we're looking at that pH range. But that said, you can also see the Axtens do have quite reasonable organic matter levels in their soils, all above 5% there. So from that point of view, some good buffering of those extreme pHs, and of course, all of the benefits that organic matter brings in terms of moisture holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity, food source, and etc. for biology. So certainly a good foundation to improve soil health is having those good organic matter levels, which theirs are quite good examples. Then we can see in terms of some of the other nutrients, you can see here that, which is classic of a lot of the soil types in this part of the world, in Western Canada, there's classic kind of quite low in phosphorus, available phosphorus, similar to in Australia. And here we can see that sulfur is also quite low. So these are two of the nutrients that immediately emerge as imbalances to kind of keep an eye on. And looking down at the base saturation here, you can see we also have soils characterized by very high calcium, so quite an excess of calcium, all above 80% there. So that again presents some challenges with terms of high calcium soils locking up other minerals, etc. And then you can also see their magnesium levels are reasonable, kind of a bit of a mixed bag there. Some a little okay, some a little high, but magnesium reasonably across the board okay. And then you can see the potassium also perhaps a little on the low side. And of course, with a high calcium soil like that, high calcium does have that tendency to antagonize the availability of magnesium and potassium. So there's a couple little examples there just to give some background to the soil. Let's have a look at some of the traces. The two things that kind of flag in this soil type here is zinc and boron. Again, some similarities to many Australian soils. These would be the two kind of traces that are also commonly limiting in this part of the world. Copper would be perhaps another one to a slightly lesser extent. And then the last thing, I'm going to come back to this on this particular soil test. We're also going to talk about this today, is the focus on the total levels in the soil, not just looking at the plant available fractions, but also looking at those totals. And I'm going to come back to that one as we just kind of now go through this example. So really, I put this image up here just to I'm going to just take a minute to explain this slide and put this up here to frame the discussions as we then move through the rest of the case study. Is that what we're here to kind of present today is that the Axtens use multiple strategies to manage their chemical fertility. So it's not just simply a matter of looking at the fertility, the chemistry, and applying inputs, fertilizers, etc. to manage that. What we're then going to hear from is that that's one part of it, but their strategy then focuses on biology and focuses on diversity, and using those two other strategies specifically with the goal of focusing on unlocking and making available some of the total fractions of the nutrients in the soil. So it's kind of shifting that mindset around just simply using nutrients to manage the fertility, that there are these other biological and plant species diversity strategies that do help with nutrient cycling, do help with unlocking fertility, and do help with cycling nutrients for crop production. And so really this slide is just to highlight that many of the soil tests that we will typically measure when we're using soil analysis to measure the nutrients, typically often they'll be looking at the more plant available fractions, say the smallest pool that's soluble in the soil water, that slightly larger pool, the exchangeable fraction. These are the two fractions that are perhaps a little more plant available. And of course, soluble nutrients are those that sit in the soil water, and the exchangeable nutrients are those that are held to those soil surfaces, to the clays, the sands, the silts, the organic matter. These are the nutrients that are held to those soil mineral surfaces and organic surfaces. And of course, they're called exchangeable because the plant can exchange hydrogen, release organic acids, and exchange those nutrients off the exchange for uptake. So these are your two fractions that are generally more plant available. And the point really is just to say that these two fractions do only make up a very small percentage of the total pool. There is a whole host of more nutrients present in soils. They are there, they are present, but they are in unavailable forms. They're either locked up, tightly embedded within the soil clay structures, in the mineral matrix of the soil, or they're locked up with other minerals bound together to precipitate out of solubility to form these locked up insoluble and unavailable compounds. But the point then is to say that that fraction of totals, that pool of totals, is significant. And that's what we're then going to focus on when we hear from Tanis and Derek, who will then talk about this low input strategy that obviously has a focus on unlocking those totals. So I've tabulated here, I've just pulled this data straight out of the soil test that we saw earlier. So it's exactly the same. I've just retabulated it here. And it's just to give a quick demonstration. What we're looking at here is some of the major nutrients and looking at the numbers of what is more plant available versus then that total fraction. And if we scan our eye down all of these, you can see that there's this consistent trend of the available fractions being much smaller than the total pool, i.e. there's a lot more in that total pool than what we simply measure just when we're doing plant available tests. And okay, well, let's look at sulfur and phosphorus, because we flagged those two earlier as being limiting according to the soil test. And yes, when we look at the plant available fractions, yeah, sulfur does indeed look low, as does phosphorus, but look how much of the total phosphorus is also present in that soil. Look how much total sulfur there, and look how much total phosphorus is available also in this soil. So you can see it's many times, tenfold or more, many times the fold greater amounts of nutrients that are present, but just not necessarily plant available. And here's, again, looking at those trace elements, exactly the same example here. We highlighted that zinc looked very low. The available fraction of zinc looked very low, but here we can see that indeed there are good total reserves of that zinc. It's there, but it's just locked up with other minerals. And again, we can see a similar trend here with for example, boron. Okay, so really that's just to emphasize that point. Soils do have significant reserves, and therefore there is that argument, and we have two schools of thought here, of course, that one then says, well, soils do have plenty of nutrients present in them. The focus needs to be more on that biology, on the cycling, on the release. You know, another school of thought, the traditional school of thought, would look at these soil tests and say, well, zinc is low, let's put some zinc on. Two schools of thought, and I guess what we're going to talk about here today is a bit of a combination or a middle ground or a hybrid of that approach. So based on those numbers, here's an example of some of the fertility kind of programs that the Axtens would use. They use a bit of ammonium sulfate as a broadcast or for their cereals used on cereal crops. Only, not on their legume and broadleaf kind of intercrops, but here I'm talking about their cereals. So there's a bit of nitrogen and sulfur going down. And then really that's all in terms of their dry kind of fertility. Then they do everything else through the liquid inject, which again, Tanis and Derek are going to expand on this, which is injected into the furrow with the seed. So, okay, here's an example of, for example, what they mix up to go into that mineral mix, into that liquid inject mix. We highlighted that zinc and boron were low before earlier, a little bit of molybdenum. They put that molybdenum in there to support nitrogen fixation from the N-fixing bacteria. So you've got a couple of traces there going down, and then it's a mix of other carbon-based stabilizers and biostimulants, etc. So a little bit of fish, a little bit of humic acid, and a little bit of molasses there. So that's kind of an example of, based on some of those limitations that we saw earlier, we were putting together some traces to be injected down, and then a little bit of nitrogen and sulfur through the ammonium sulfate. So that's kind of where an example of what they were applying a couple of seasons ago. And of course, it's a continual refining process. Now, it should also be linked with tissue analysis or sap analysis. I would encourage farmers to tweak, you know, soil tests are very valuable, but soil and what goes into the crop, what's taken up by the crop, is not necessarily always perfectly correlated. In theory, they should mirror each other, but in practice they don't. So here we're looking at sap analysis to then say, okay, well, what we're just, again, this is just one example. This was from Spelt. You know, just for brevity of time, we're just cherry picking some examples here for the case study. But so here we have an example on Spelt. Now you can see again that potassium looks perhaps a little marginal, and funnily enough, that calcium is limiting. Now this is a very common thing we see on high calcium soils. Even though calcium was present in excess, the availability of that calcium is not necessarily always so high. That high calcium tends to lock up with other minerals, and when it locks up with other minerals, it also locks itself up. So it's a very common thing. We do see calcium deficient plants growing in excess calcium, high calcium soils, and he would be a good example indeed of that. Looking into some of the other examples here, you can see, yep, sulfur and phosphorus, that was a good mirror. They look certainly marginal in the plant, and we can see some of the traces. Iron, low, manganese, a little marginal, even though there was ample in the soil. Of course, that high pH soil, that high calcium, that can block and antagonize the uptake of those other particularly trace minerals would be a good example. And we can see here that zinc is also low in the plant. However, we can also see the boron looks quite reasonable in this particular example. So I put this up here just as an example to highlight that yes, the soil tests are valuable, and then we should take that to the next level of fine tuning with SAP or tissue analysis to then refine our inputs as we go through and learn from season to season. So here's then an example of kind of what their current kind of mix was for this season. It's just showing a bit of an evolution of their program here. And so you can see that we've got a little bit of guano powder going in, and that's going to supply some of that calcium in a more available form, but of course a little bit of phosphorus, addressing that low phosphorus that we identified was also low earlier as well. In with that, a little bit of potassium sulfate, so a little bit of K and a little bit of sulfur, both of those being a little marginal. And then we can see some trace elements here: iron, zinc sulfate, iron sulfate, manganese sulfate, just very, very small amounts that are going in. There's all the rates there, very tiny amounts, not, you know, there was enough in the soil already, as we highlighted in manganese and iron, but it's just about putting very small amounts right there in that furrow in which the plant can take up early on before those minerals get locked up, etc. So they've put a little bit in there in the starter mix, along with a little bit of boron, and again that molybdenum, and all of those nutrients, the chemical fertility there again gets put in a base of a kind of a biostimulant mix, your fish and molasses, you know, these kinds of things. So carbon sources to help bind to those minerals, kind of chelate and complex them, and then those carbon sources are also, of course, food sources for the biology, for the organisms to help establish and feed on the carbon, and that carbon helps to kind of buffer some of the minerals and nutrients that are going out there. So what then happens to that mineral mix, that combination of nutrition and carbon biostimulant type mix? Then those two components get mixed into a base of compost extract. So then you've got those three pieces of the puzzle: the nutrients, the carbon, and the biology, and that becomes the kind of the three-part formula in which is then injected into the furrow at the time of seeding. And again, ammonium sulfate on the cereals only there. So that's where I'll hand over to Tanis, as now she will then take over and highlight how they make their compost and how they make their compost extracts, etc. Oops, sorry, I forgot this slide. Just all this was quickly just to say is that where to next, some future things in development for the Axtens from a nutritional fertility point of view. They'll be taking steps to kind of begin reducing their AMS, those ammonium sulfate inputs, looking at substituting up into the foliar using things like foliar urea and generally some foliar trials. You know, I kind of pointed out to them that you know, many of those minerals were present in adequate total amounts. So there's not necessarily a huge advantage to putting more into the soil. We might want to focus more on just delivering that directly into the plant, bypassing those soil imbalances, bypassing that high pH, that high calcium, and delivering that straight and directly into the plant through the foliar. So that's kind of where to next for them. Some of the things they'll be doing in the next few years, few growing seasons, etc. Okay, so now we'll hear from Tanis, who will talk a little bit about some of the biological parts of their injection systems. Unless there was a burning question, Brendan.
No, nothing here. Joel.
Okay.
Just that was just a great insight into the Axten soil, and yeah, basically a brief summary on what they're getting up to with low inputs, which was really exciting to see. Looking forward to hearing their great presentation now, and yeah, we'll get Tanis to give her presentation, and yeah, we'll see what she has to say with her passion about biology, hopefully. So good afternoon to you, Tanis, and welcome.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
No problem.
Yep.
Okay, good. I apologize for the delayed internet. This rural Southern Saskatchewan internet is not great, but it is what it is. So, like Joel said, I'll be talking a little bit about the biological aspect of our farm. Little bit of background. Before I married Derek and became a farmer with him, I was a high school biology teacher. So when Derek had heard Dr. Elaine Ingham speak and talk about the biology that's in the soil, how important it is, how it can cycle nutrients for us, it was a huge eye-opener. And he knew something like that would be right up my alley. And so my biological past and my farming future kind of met in the middle, and it was really exciting. So from there, I took Dr. Elaine Ingham's compost class, life in the soils class, and microscope class, just so that I could learn more about how the soil is supposed to function. We'd been very focused on what's occurring above the ground and hadn't put a lot of thought into what's occurring below. So with this class, I was able to learn how to identify some of the organisms in the soil, see what should be there, and don't have the ability to, decide if any, what the species genus are, but at least have an idea of what the organisms are and whether or not they are beneficial. So of course, take this course, learn a bunch, super excited to go look at our soils. So I go get a sample, take a look, and very disappointed. It was highly bacterial. Looking at this slide, if you see the little dots in the background, that's bacteria. They're very boring, not very fun to look at, and I knew there should be more in there to help recycling nutrients. So from there, we knew we kind of had two goals. Number one, we needed to restore some of this life back into our soil. And number two, we needed to make sure we were creating an environment where this biology could thrive and come back to life. So the first thing we started doing, I think we started composting. Our first piles we made were in 2016. Wanted to use local ingredients, things we had around, byproducts. So we no longer own cattle, but our neighbors just across the highway have small corrals. So we came up with a good deal with them where if we clean their corrals, we got their manure for free. So the nice part about that too is there's a lot of straw bedding pack. So added a nice woody component. We also use hay. We've got another neighbor that likes to bale our slough hay and get some bales from there. The grain cleaning plant, we also have grain screenings. So we use those, and also grain hulls from things like when we dehull the spelt. So those are our main ingredients we've been using. One thing we found to be very important in making our windrows is consistency. So we went to using TMR vertical mixer, put all our ingredients in, mix it up good, add some moisture, and with that, we make our windrows. When we first started, we were using manure to do, we'd start a pile and then continue down the windrow. And because the manure was being taken from different places within the corrals, our nitrogen levels were all over. So sometimes one end of the pile would be heating way faster than the other end. So we found it very important to mix it, make a consistent row. So yeah, we're excited to play around with some different ingredients. This year we're going to try making some without manure. And just try to find, a good carbon to nitrogen ratio so that we get that heat, yet not too much. So I we've done mostly thermal composting. I like thermal composting because we have the ability then to kill weed seeds and kill pathogens. So once the windrow is made, there's constant monitoring. Watch the temperature, check the moisture. Need to get it hot enough to kill the pathogens and weed seeds, yet not so hot that you're killing the beneficial biology. So we have a Sittler compost turner that we use to turn the rows when they reach the appropriate temperature. And that allows the inside to move to the outside and cool off, and what's been on the outside to get into the inside and start to heat. We also rigged up our water truck with a bit of an arm so that we can add moisture. I like to keep the moisture to about 50%. So yeah, that's kind of our composting system. So you see, we usually get to it in the fall. So in the picture on the right, you can see it's, you know, it's below zero, it's frosty out, but when you put those ingredients together, it is amazing the heat that is created, and they steam like crazy. Usually end up turning them 3 to 5 times, just depends on how carried away Derek got away with throwing some green screenings in and how hot they get. But within 2 months, generally, they come back down to ambient temperature and they're good to go. With the microscope, it's been extremely beneficial because then I can look at the compost and I'm looking for fungi, bacteria, you know, microarthropods, nematodes, bacteria. I'm really looking for diversity. I want to see a little bit of everything at least. So it's amazing the variety we'll get even within the compost piles. Also with the microscope, sorry, I think my slides are maybe a little delayed, but they're coming. Sometimes you see things that I'm just not sure what's going on. This is an example where I could see, you know, this thread-like organism growing. Wasn't sure, you know, is it good, is it bad, should I be concerned? So take some tweezers and my microscope and have a look. And so this is just an example of, you know, what those white strings look like underneath the microscope, and, you know, seeing the wide diameter and the septa of this fungal hyphae. It was a good indication that it was a beneficial fungi. So always a little bit of a relief. So even with all the compost we make, it's not enough to spread and cover all of our acres. So we usually save the majority of our compost and spread it on the fields that we think need the most. You know, like our porous land that needs the biggest boost. Kind of think of the compost is, you know, a bit of an inoculant. So one way we can get these organisms out to every acre is by making a compost extract. So generally in the spring, I'll go take a sample of each one of my piles of compost and pick my top 3 to 4 favorite, just looking for diversity. Sometimes one pile will have more protozoa, one more nematodes. And it's important to me not just to have the fungi and bacteria, but to have some of these higher trophic levels that will help cycle the nutrients. So on the right, we've got a tank. It's about a 9,500 liter tank. Fill it with water. There's an air bubbler so it can bubble air up the bottom. And then I also have the air diffusers like you see on the bottom left, and they go in the basket. I fill them with compost and they're placed into the water, and the air diffuses through them and helps wash the organisms out of the compost and into the water. Because the water tank is so big and my baskets, I've only got 4 of these for the tank. I'll usually let them extract, you know, 20 minutes to a half hour, and then I'll dump out the compost and put fresh compost in to wash the organisms out of that. Once again, that's where the microscope becomes really useful, and I'll just keep watching samples until I find the diversity and the quantity of organisms is substantial. Before then, this will be mixed in, as Joel showed in our, what goes in furrow, our micronutrients and biostimulants then are mixed with this right when it goes into the drill and out to the field so that it's placed in furrow. What else did I want to say about this? What's that? Oh, how much we put in? Say it again.
Well, 4 gallons of acre.
Yeah, generally it ends up to be about 4 to 6 gallons per acre. I don't know how that translates to liters, but that's generally about the amount of compost extract that's going in furrow. Also just wanted to share quickly my vermicompost. We cut down a few totes, threw in some compost, got some worms, and let them do their thing. I feed them hulls and paper and food waste, whatever we have around, and water them and then catch the leachate. Usually do this throughout the winter because our winters get quite cold. I have to bring them into the heated shop so that the biology and the worms can stay active. And I catch the leachate and then put it into a barrel and store it sealed. We then use that in the spring as a seed dressing. We coat the seeds, usually 5 to 7 liters per ton is the amount we'll use. We no longer do any chemical seed treatments. We've went to using only a biological stimulant. This, I mean, because it's a leachate and the water slowly goes through the compost or the vermicompost, there's not a lot of organisms in that liquid. But as you can see, it's a dark brown, which it's amazing. Even, you know, I'll water these and it stays so dark brown. Obviously, there's a lot of humics, perhaps biostimulants, autoinducers. I don't always understand it all, but it sure feels a lot better putting on the seed than a chemical. So that's what we use at seeding time. One other thing we just tried last summer was making a static compost pile. We had Dr. Christine Jones and Jerry Gillespie out at our farm. And so basically it's the same idea. We use the same ingredients, mix them up in the TMR mixer, made just small short piles. But instead of an aerobic pile, it's anaerobic because it's sealed. Jerry calls it a spice method. So I think it's a really interesting concept. Now we haven't went to the next level and made any extracts or leachates with this, but it is definitely something that we want to try, even as a combination to use with the compost extract. We're just still figuring out exactly how to use it. So yeah, that's kind of a overview. Our farm has really changed our focus, and the soil is what we focus on so that it can provide for the life that should be within it. And every operation we do, we just try to keep in mind, how will this affect our soil biology, and is it worth it? Also, it seems, you know, it's very important to create an environment for this biology to survive. So that's more what Derek's going to talk to you about next, some of our systems and what we do to create a positive environment. And from there, I guess if there's any questions, go ahead and I'll switch over to Derek's slideshow.
Thanks, Tanis, for that. That was fantastic. It was a great insight to what you're up to with your compost and everything. It looks fairly involving, and really enjoyed your overview on your microscope work, which, yeah, makes me feel like going to do a microscope course now. So, Derek, we'll get you to do your presentation now, which is good afternoon to you, Derek, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning to you guys. I guess it's afternoon here, but yeah, this is great. Looking forward to sharing what we do. Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump into it. This is if everyone can see and hear me okay, this is just a picture of our farm. I like to include this just to give a little context, because if you can see, this is looking west of our yard. and we literally farm on the edge of where they quit farming. My grandpa got off the train at our town because it was the last stop, sort of thing. So we are on the edge of some real fragile, some really challenging terrain. We got a lot of hills and a lot of light soils, but I guess as you can see, some of the soil tests, they surprise me even how far we've come, with changing our practices. But anyway, yeah, I always like that picture of my dad. He's 76 and he's actually here. He's moving grain around the yard today, still involved. And I think, it's funny, but I think a lot of what we've done has brought a lot of enjoyment back to the farm, So yeah, it's been really good. I kind of like to start with this, the mindset change that we had to undergo, and and it took a long time. And I guess, and I credit a lot of that change to Dr. Dwayne Beck and some of the guys in that whole South Dakota, North Dakota region that opened our eyes to that we can farm different. This monocrop was probably 12-year-old picture that we used to think was sort of the goal. There was really no residue, and it was one crop, and it looked, that was sort of the goal. And it took us a little bit of time, and we sort of stumbled into intercropping kind of by accident. But when we really stepped back and looked at it, and we looked at this like the native prairie, and that's literally across the road from our yard. There's 120 some species in a good healthy native range here. That's what you'll find with shortgrass prairie. And that was the system that was here before we showed up with our plows 120 years ago. And it worked, obviously. That's why it was there when we got here. And we've just gone so much the other direction that we kind of, I guess, lost sight of what functions. And, so that's where intercropping kind of fit in. And I want to give a bit of an overview of sort of what our farming system looks like. There's a lot of pieces to our puzzle, and it is always kind of a moving system. We're always trying new things. But the one thing we're really going to talk about today of all these different things is the intercrops. And I always like to think about, I always put live roots in the middle, because I still think if there's anything I could pick of all the things we do, the live roots, more live root days, more diverse live root days, I think are, would be the one thing I would start with. Yeah, so intercropping. 2009, we accidentally seeded some lentils on some mustard stubble, and we had some herbicide issues, and we had our first non-planned intercrop. And it was, of course, by the highway, so all the neighbors could see it and see the mess. In places in that field, it was sort of a nice mixture of enough lentils and enough mustard that it looked okay. And then when it all shook out, we took some mustard off that we were able to sell, and the price was good that year. And it really got me thinking, that maybe there's something to this. So did a little research, and I didn't realize that this was a thing. This is old news. I mean, this was nothing that we had invented. And did some research and found that intercropping has been practiced for a long time. So and then that took us till 11 for me to get the gumption back up to plant like our planned canola pea was the very first thing we did. It was a clear field canola pea on a couple of quarters, and I guess I kind of credit the fact that it went really well the first year is why we're doing so much now. And we've tried a multitude of mixes, and I think I've got a list later on. We've probably tried over 15 different mixes, and these are sort of my three staples that we're using today on the farm, actually. So we've got we started off with some real simple peas, but I soon realized we can grow some of these high value peas that they're vine types that lay down, that they're a bit of a nightmare to harvest, but when you put them in a mustard, they'll trellis, and it works really well. Chickpeas and flax was an absolute game changer for us. We were out of the chickpea game because of the fungicide and the disease problems, and yeah, and I'll get into this. And lentil and flax too was another super good one that we're really, really happy with. And like I always say, I mean, I used to think that either you get greater yield or reduce inputs, but I've changed. I mean, we're seeing both. We're seeing overall greater yields combinations, plus we're doing less inputs. We never did back even in 11. That's when we started experimenting with the fertility. We never did do any nitrogen on our first intercrop, and it just sort of carried through. Just a quick list of some. I think you guys are having better luck with beans than me, but faba beans just don't like our dry. We, but that is one of the pictures I've got in here. But the fava beans just don't seem to do really well here. We'll grow some plants, but then we get super hot in flowering, and then the flowers blast, and it doesn't seem to work out that well. But yeah, actually, we've done more than this. It just didn't all fit on the page. So I just want to touch quickly on how we do it. The alternate row seeding has been proving to be sort of the way for us. No, I'm not saying it's for everyone, but we've been experimenting with alternate row seeding kind of on and off since about 2014. And this year we did most of our intercrops alternate row. And so real simple, these come from your country. These are these towers we got from smaller. Just because that 5-plex John Deere, that 60-foot John Deere folds up, it's such a nightmare the way it folds. In order for us to be able to do front row, back row, we put their towers on there nice and tidy. We basically just we move the hoses from one tower to the other. They're numbered, and then we just put plugs in where we take the hoses off, and then we'll run the flax and mustard and those sort of things don't mind the disorganization of having plugged holes, I'm finding. But chickpeas, field peas, beans, the big ones, they don't really like that. So we try to put the big seed through the towers that are made for 4-run or 5-run, and then the small seed will go out through the towers with the plugs. And it also allows us to move our blockage. So we can literally, 2 guys can change this drill from like, single shoot, whatever you want to call it, same row to alternate row in about 20 minutes. There's 72 runs on that drill. It doesn't take as long to go down with a screw gun, and it allows us to maintain our blockage. It's really simple. And I can provide more pictures after. And the other big piece of the puzzle for us have been these peristolic pumps. These actually come from your country as well, I believe. And there was a guy I ran into at No-Till on the Plains in 2000, and I'm not even sure, 17, maybe 16. We were really struggling with how to get these, like this compost biological mix into the furrow. We were trying an orifice-based system, and it made for some, I don't know, words with Tanis and I, because I know we really wanted to do it, but we were having so much trouble, like physically getting it in with an orifice-based system. It was a nightmare. A fellow come out of the crowd, his name's Ben Smith, and introduced himself and introduced me to these pumps, and boy, these things they've absolutely changed it for us. So yeah, anyway, just a quick, I think there's other varieties. I mean, John Blue makes some peristolic pumps, but boy, they sure do work well. Yeah, so intercropping, flax and chickpeas. It's the first intercrop we did on alternating rows. There was a research farm at Redverse, Saskatchewan that was been experimenting with these, and we went out and had a look, and she's in a much wetter area than we are. And the fact that we were there during flowering and looking at her chickpeas, and she was not seeing disease problems, we just came home. I actually, the first year, we did 1,500 acres of this the first year, and had a really good success. And of course, I always have to push the system. So last year we just thought, well, we thought we sort of had this disease thing under control. So in the name of being lazy, we did some same row flax chickpea last year, and yeah, it didn't work out so good. So we wound up having to spray. First time we've sprayed fungicide since we started growing chickpeas. We were losing ground, and I know never say never, and I won't. There's no hill I'll die on, so we sprayed. It's just the way it is. It sucked, but we did it. But then this year, obviously, we went back. Just for context, I mean, guys, chickpea growers, there's probably lots in your audience. These chickpeas are flowering, and when you look down in the canopy, you're seeing, we're not seeing a bunch of cornflakes on the ground. There's the leaves are, we're not browning off. They're, and this is no fungicide and well into the season. And just sort of what it looks like in the hopper. I mean, people are always curious about harvest, and it really isn't that big of a deal. The chickpeas do the work. Sort of the only real worst case scenario with this, other than weeds, which I've heard that happens. It's happened to us, of course, too. Is a poor chickpea crop, because the chickpeas really do a lot of the work in the combine, and you want to make sure you have enough population. So I took some pictures, tried to get some new slides. This is from this year. This was early on in the season, and I actually took this last 2 nights ago. So that gives you an idea where we're at in the season. The The small ones were, yeah, I suppose a month ago, and then we're just starting to flower now. We're definitely behind as far as timing's going, but things are looking really good. We're super clean. Our plants are clean. I talked to a neighbor yesterday afternoon. They're on their 3rd pass of fungicide on their monocrop chickpeas, and we haven't sprayed. And you know, I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years, and the neighbors know we do it, but nobody will try it. I don't know. It's funny how things work that way. And I want to also touch on the yellow mustard and pea. This is same thing. This is a current picture, or this was a spring picture, I guess. It's the first year we've been doing since we've started the yellow mustard and peas that we've actually done alternate rows. We've had some problems with the peas getting ahead of the mustard, and then the peas kind of win, and the fact that we grow these vine type peas, the whole thing lays down. So I guess I'm kind of a slow learner. We've been intercropping for 10 years now, and it took me until now to figure out that maybe I should try that in alternate rows. And man, what a difference. It's just, I'll just click ahead, and it might take a second to load, but we took these pictures maybe 4 or 5 days ago, and it's just an absolute jungle. I was telling Joel, I mean, if a murderer was chasing you, that's not the place you want to run, because you aren't going to get very far. Worked out really well. We have good mustard population. It's standing very well. There seems to be good airflow. So yeah, white mold can be a real issue for us if we get too much biomass, in the area, I should say. We haven't seen it yet personally, but Aphanomyces is another one that's been a bit of an issue in the area we haven't seen. So there've definitely been some benefits. And yeah, we actually I wanted to put a picture too. We just dump our inoculant in with that whole mix that Joel explained. We do it right literally in the field when we're filling the caddy on the seeder, and it just goes in for, kind of gives us the sort of granular distribution. I'm not sure there, but up here, granular inoculant costs us like in the $12 an acre. So I know that's like $30 a hectare range, where just with real simple inoculant, we can do it for, sort of $2, that's a big savings for us. And, I really like how we get distribution sort of all over the root zone, whether like with granular, sometimes it was really centered mostly right around the seed. Yeah, quick note on harvesting. We have green combines. I don't know, don't hold that against me. But we've tried about every concave, I think, that's made in North America. And we've basically just gone back, every specialty, my helical combine, concave is the best, tried them all. And we've gone back to simple John Deere large wire concaves. And that seems to work really well. We run one small wire in the front, two large wires behind that in the machines, and we don't have to change concaves. It works well in our cereals. It works well in our intercrops. I'm getting older and lazier, so I like it simple. And I've got this picture up because these are the same fields from 2007, 18, I think. We were stripping flax and chickpeas, and it was actually working quite well that year. We've tried to strip as many acres as we can, but we had some snow at harvest, which is always fun, and it laid a bunch of the stuff down flat. So we had to go back in with our flex heads, and that shows you just that's the same, but just what a difference. It's, in my eyes, the strip is so much more beneficial. And for us, we like to harvest as much snow as we can. So the strip, is great that way for catching snow, where we have to cut it and spread it. There's nothing left, it's just, yeah, it's not the same. Yeah. I always, and they always tell me, everybody has struggles, right? And stripping like as many crops as possible is definitely the goal. This is flax and lentils on the left there that you're seeing, and we just can't make it work. We're working with the Shelbourne guys here in Kansas. We're going to try some modifications on the header and move our shroud farther ahead. They think that's the problem, but we can strip it all day long and it does a good job. Our header losses are just super high in the lentil flax, and we can't figure out what we're doing wrong. So we're going to try some other things, but I sure like how that looks. It's fast and efficient, and it obviously fits the no-till system well. And this is one of our absolute disasters. We had about 1,000 acres of mustard and peas. Then the peas won by a landslide last year, and we had some rain at harvest, and they were about as flat could be. This is partly why we've gone to the alternate rows, because we want to make sure the mustard has a chance, and I think it's going to make a big difference. But it was super, super painful. Luckily, we didn't have to cut it one way. We thought we were going to have to, but instead of harvesting 400 or 500 acres a day, we were like less than half of that, and luckily we did have some good weather. But yeah, it happens. I mean, not everything is sunshine and rainbows in the intercropping world. Yeah, and I also kind of like this picture because we chose a 9-meter control traffic system, partly because of our hills, but because our John Deere combines aren't the world's best spreaders, so we want to make sure we can get the residue spread back up. And they're challenged at times even to get a decent spread on 9 meters. So now you've got this mixed up intercrop. Now what? We started with rotary screens. I think you guys have got those. We have these machines here called quick cleans that are kind of a auger and a screen. That did not work very well. We found them very hard on peas. They didn't 60,000 bushels, so what's that, a couple thousand tons, and they were wore out like that. So that wasn't good. So we did that for a few years, and then about 6 seasons ago, we bought this in the middle. It's just a mobile seed plant. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the similar things. It's an air screen, and actually it's an indent first, aspirator, air screen, gravity table. And when we first bought this, the plan was just to separate intercrops faster, and it did that. And then we figured out we were able to actually pull our refuse off. So all the light screenings and the weed seeds and all that, we were able to pull off, and then we keep home. And then that obviously goes in the compost program, and Tanis takes over with that. But with the gravity table and the way the equipment was, we were actually able to clean some of this stuff sort of to exports grade. Maybe not obviously not food grade because we don't have a destoner or anything, but we could put some things into a sea can and capture some value out of that, because we're going to run it through anyway. So then that's sort of, well, if we're going to grow things that we're going to clean, well, let's grow things that have more value if they're clean. So that's what got us sort of into some seed production, some specialty markets. And it's funny how one thing leads to another. I mean, it was doors opening that we didn't even know were there. So we did this for quite a while, but I was just, we end up doing a fair bit of it. We do some at harvest, but we wind up doing some during the winter, and that's no fun, really, when it's minus 30. So we've been 2 years basically on this now, and this photo isn't quite up to date, but it gives you an idea of what we're doing. Sort of a high throughput, and this thing is going to be, it's food grade. So that's going to open some doors, let us get into some markets that we didn't, I guess the things we weren't even thinking about 5 years ago. And then we're planning to do some further value adding from there, but this will allow us to do the lion's share of our separation at harvest, because this thing is super big and fast. We added a color sorter, those sort of things that can get it, if we run into a problem for whatever reason. So one thing about intercropping is sometimes we wind up with some mixes that we weren't planning on, and this thing will be able to get us out of the odd bind, and just make life simpler and quality of life. I mean, there's always that. And the other thing too is we always talk about regeneration of soils, but one thing Tanis and I are fairly passionate about is regeneration of community. I'm sick of watching my town die, and everybody complains about it, but nobody's doing anything about it. And like, we used to be a 1-employee farm, and we've got 4 guys working here now, and with families. And I think we can do better than that. I think there's room for growth there. So that's that was part of the thought behind this as well. So I wanted to include this. I'm getting kind of to the end, but I wanted to include, so this is what the mess looks like. This is lentils and flax, and it does look a little hairy. This is a picture I scooped out of the back of a combine. So when we run it through, our small seeds wind up being sort of the byproduct. So we don't actually, like, this isn't our clean version, but this flax is good enough to go to town in a commercial fashion, to a mailer. Somebody else will take it and further add, or we can return around and clean it ourselves. And then we can clean it ourselves and maybe further value add from there. And then we also but the small or the large seed, sorry, the large seed lentils in this example, we do, you know, peas, chickpeas, that product will come out clean. So when we're done, other than there's a few chips and whatever on there, but so it's there's 99.5, 99.7 clean will be good enough to go into a sea can, you know, good enough, you know, there's value there having them like that. And we can do this at a pretty good speed now, so we can actually keep up to the combines. And yeah, that's sort of where we've wound up. And anyway, I better, in the name of time, I guess we're at the end. Hopefully there's some questions. No,
thank you, Derek. It was a fantastic insight into your diversity and how your intercrops are working for you. And yeah, I think from the looks of it, you're very happy with how they're working, and you've certainly invested a lot of time and energy into setting your farm up to work around it. So I've just got one interesting question here to you, Derek. With your reduced fungicide use, do you find your residues are breaking down quicker and cycling back for your next crop?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. You know, it's funny. I remember like the third year like when we've been disc seeding since 2007. And I remember going back in maybe about 08 or 09, we were having hairpin troubles, and we were thinking about giving up on it, go back to Beck's, and because it was an issue, you know, and he, you know, he said, just give it time, you know, and yeah, honest to God, now we have the opposite problem. I mean, you've seen in the pictures, like we just don't have enough, and we're changing our rotation. Even like we're going to grow less legumes, and we're going to, you know, those are some of the things I think are going to have to happen. We're going to get more cereals into rotation, more cereals into our cover crops. Because yeah, I definitely, that's a definite observation. With less fungicides, I think things are cycling quicker.
Hey, Derek, you mentioned about the alternate rows is working well for you with the intercrops. Can you just expand on that a little bit, why that's working well as opposed to just mixed rows, please?
Sure. You know, it's funny because it does bother me that, I mean, like, I think from a root interaction standpoint, we're probably, it's not as ideal as mixed rows. But what we're finding here is a lot of times we won't be, we don't have the moisture that I'd like to have at seeding time. So this allows us to seed, you know, at the appropriate depth. Because normally when we mix row, we sort of compromise, which works. But this way, we can sort of, you know, we can put the flax at, you know, whatever, a centimeter or centimeter and a half, and the chickpeas 3 times that if we have to. And that happened again this spring. We started off super wet, and then the wind blows and it gets dry. And that's a big thing. And I think like the last 3 seasons, we've had some bad spring frosts. Like we get our frosts in the spring, and the mustard or the canolas, they get beat up so bad by the frost that the peas seem to get ahead. And once they're 6 inches tall and the mustard is still a 2-leaf, it's, you know, it's sort of over, you know, and that's what's been happening to us. This way, if they're in their own rows, even if we do have a frost or some other stressor, you know, flea beetles, you know, you name it, they seem to recover in their own rows better, I guess. I think is what we're seeing. And it's also allowed us to even dial our seeding rates back more yet, like we're lower than we were, it seems. So those have been sort of the benefits of it.
So you mean, like, if things get tough at the end, if it gets a bit dry, the 2 species are kind of less competitive if they're in individual rows? Is that what you mean at the end?
It seems, yeah, like especially if it's really small. Like we had like last May 29th, we had a -9, you know, and the stuff was all up, you know, a couple inches tall, and it, like the canola or the mustard, sorry, and the flax, they turned black. I thought they were all dead. They come back for the most part, but they were so far behind that they were so far behind that, you know, the battle was kind of won then, you know. And the same thing happened with our chickpeas, and I think that's why we had disease problems, because our flax was so thin with our chickpeas in the same row that it didn't provide any benefit. So we basically had a monocrop chickpea crop, you know, and same thing with the peas. So yeah, we're gonna definitely do some exploring. I mean, we've experimented with cereal legume intercrops. We've never had any luck, but now seeing this alternate row, I think I'm gonna maybe give it a try again. You know, small acres next year, but just give it a try and see if there's something there. I know I've like talking with Joel that seems to be the most common combination, and we've never had very good luck with it. We've tried it a few times and it just doesn't seem to work here for us.
Mm-hmm. Is there any harvest issues there, Derek, with that alternate rows with your intercrops, or have you got a tight row spacing? Like, what sort of row spacing do you want?
Well, we've got two different machines. We got one that's on 25s, I guess, like 10-inch, and then we've got a planter that's on 15s, so 37.5, I guess. And nothing yet. I'm actually hoping. Well, we've like the Flax and Chickpeas that did work. The alternate rows actually seem to strip better, and I don't know why. Daniel was Shelbourne. He's sort of our main Shelbourne guy here. Thinks that there isn't enough room between the front of the shroud and the fingers, so we're going to try to move that shroud ahead maybe about 10 centimeters to give the crop more room to pop up in between. Because we were leaving like for a couple of bushels, so like 120 pounds, 50 kilos on the ground per acre, like a lot bad. Like we couldn't afford to do that, so we had to go back and flex them. But we definitely want to strip as many acres as we can. But we haven't seen any big maturity issue differences yet. But maybe we're just lucky. I know guys have had problems, and I know I've said we don't have trouble, and not going to say that nobody else is going to have trouble, but the maturity has always seemed to work out for us.
Have you done any intercropping with cereals?
Like we've tried faba beans with barley, wheat, oats. Tried some peas and oats. No, not peas and oats. Peas and wheat, and it just seems like the cereals win. And if for every bushel of pea or bean I get, I just lose a bushel of wheat. We do pretty thorough yield trials. Like, it's one thing I love about control traffic is we can do pretty consistent, good, trials and weigh them out and random replicated. And yeah, it just seemed like we couldn't get any, like with us, with intercropping with the broadleaf legume combinations, we generally always get like over yielding, whatever you want to call it. We just couldn't get it with the cereals. And I know in places in the world it just works, and that's why we're going to give the alternate row cereal legume, some kind of a go.
So otherwise, you're happy just to run with monoculture cereals?
Yeah, and to be perfectly honest, and you guys know as well, as weed control options in intercrops is limited, right? So we sort of use our cereal year as our weed control year. I mean, our weed problems are changing. I don't know if they're getting better or not, but it seems we're shifting more to a perennial weed, more so than what we used to see. We used to be more mustard types and those sort of things, but so we're kind of using our cereal year as a weed control year, and right or wrong, that's kind of how I've been seeing it. And yeah, I guess that answers.
Derek, with your liquid inject system, are you able to elaborate a bit more about the setup with it? Like, do you run filters with that or oversized hoses then, that system?
Yeah, no, it's pretty simple. We just filter it with a 20, which is a 20 mesh. I'm not sure, does that convert for you guys? It's really coarse. Yeah, and then those those squeeze pumps, they just run like a semi airline or a truck. I'm not sure what you guys call them, but like semi truck, whatever, airlines. 3/8, like for me, it's one for each row, which works really well. And it's like you can meter anything. Like I always make a joke, you can put a cat through a blender and that thing will meter it out. Like it's phenomenal. Like it's amazing. We've actually went to as coarse basically as we can handle. So that allows us to get more solids into solution.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting.
Derek or Tanis, livestock. Is there a role for livestock in your enterprise?
I guess this must be me. Yeah. So there is. We don't own cows anymore. We did. BSE was kind of the end of the cows for us. I remember, if you guys remember, it wasn't good in Canada. So we kept our cows for a couple of years. But that being said, we had a lot of our land perimeter fence. So we've done a little bit of, the high density stock grazing, but overall, we do mostly just like a fall graze. We do seed covers as many acres as we can. Some of the companions we'll grow past harvest, that stuff grazes. We've got some cow neighbors that we work with, we just do it on a per head per day, depending on what we've got. And also, like you've seen in the picture, our farm is, it's sort of intermixed with native. There's some stuff we just can't farm that we farm around. So there's some grass in a mix with our farmland. So yeah, it's all fall winter grazing. I'm a little concerned about compaction because we don't always do a really good job of moving them as good as we could. And so we try to do it when the ground is froze. And also the snow seems to help. I know it's not something you guys have to worry about, but the snow really limits how much they take. If we can graze with snow on, it's two benefits. We don't have to deal with water when it's cold, and it also helps limit the amount of removal.
A question there for Tanis. With your biology, is there a certain ratio you work towards between bacterial and fungal?
I'm always trying to increase our fungal component. It's one thing I had struggled in the past to get high numbers in my compost and even to see in the soil. I've seen it slowly improving. At one time we were getting wood chips in, and we've seen from our pictures, we don't have trees. And if we do, it's someone's yard, so you better not cut them down. So I was getting wood chips from Northern Saskatchewan. But once again, I like to use more local ingredients. So I found these, the hulls from the spelt and other grains to be a good woody component. And yeah, flax straw is another good one we really like for a woody component. And I mean, I like more of everything in my compost. So bacteria seems to be easy. I'm always looking for more diversity, different shapes and sizes. But I'm always trying to improve the fungal, and sometimes it's just harder to get than others. But it's not as an exact science as I'd like it to be, but we're trying anyways.
Tanis, when you're making your compost extract, do you kind of make that at planting as you're going, or do you make it in advance and store it? And is there a storage interval, maximum storage time for the extract?
I try to keep that tank that I showed in the picture, the 9,500 liter tank, full all the time, constantly changing compost. So then Derek will come in and he'll pull from that. And as soon as he does, I'll once again start changing compost, get the diversity back up. So with that one tank and keeping it aerated, I can keep up to the drill. As far as storage, we do have a tank that we have used for storage, but you need to have something that you can aerate. So that becomes a bit trickier. So yeah, it's easiest just to keep it in that one aerated tank and keep changing compost.
Yeah. Tanis, is there anything special in requirements around a microscope that you use for looking at your microbes there? Is there a certain strength that is required?
I just have a basic microscope. Usually to scan a slide, I look at it 100 times. So I've got, the 10 power ocular, and then the 10 power objective gives you 100 magnification. And I use that usually to scan a slide when I'm looking kind of overall, and then go to the 40 times objective. So at 400 times magnification, you can really see, I can zoom in then to the mouth parts of a nematode, to determine whether it's a bacterial feeder or a fungal feeder. And that's usually as high as I go, is the 400 magnification.
Okay. Yeah.
Tanis, with your compost rows, you're managing the moisture and the temperature. Do you actually measure them regularly, or do you kind of just get a feel for it and just use your experience to make decisions?
No, if you noticed in the one picture there, I do have a temperature probe. So use that, usually pick a few spots throughout the windrow and carefully monitor the temperature. It's too hot to touch, so that's the best way to get an exact reading. And moisture, that I do by feel. In the course that I took, basically, you grab a handful from the middle, or whatever's not too hot to touch, and when you squeeze it in your hand, if you get like drip marks forming between your fingers, then you're at approximately 50% moisture. So that part's not an exact science, but you'll see if it's getting too dry, it'll get kind of ashy looking, and with that much heat, especially if it's generating heat fast, it can dry fast. So then we make sure to water it before we turn it and get that moisture mixed in. Yeah, sometimes it'll be every day. I usually, when we got the windrows made, I'll go out every morning first thing, and then let the guys know which piles I want turned and which ones need water. And generally then they're good for the day, and then check them again the next day.
What do? We try to do as much as we can. So, we'll have maybe a couple thousand tons on the go at one time, which is honestly easier to manage than doing a couple windrows at a time. We'll just try to do it all. And then the fall seems to work for us. We have less evaporation trouble in the fall when we're cooler and not as hot and windy. So that's partly why we do it. And then it just sort of, they seem to cool off into the fall and get froze over winter and go dormant. And it seems to work.
Mm-hmm. When you mix your compost in your TMR, do you find that the compost clumps and balls up in the mixture? If so, do you turn the windrows right away to deal with the clumps?
We have to be careful with clay. So there's the whole school of thought, guys. Sorry, I'm Tanis, I didn't mean to do that. But adding clay, and you got to be super careful with clay in there. You can have a big pile of, well, you know what? And it's not good. So we've been not using much clay, I guess. We're sort of under 5%. I guess that's something we usually add into a little bit.
Yeah, the mixer does a pretty good job of getting rid of clumps. Unless there's too much clay.
It's bad.
But then, even after the first turn, if there are any clumps, they seem to work their way out.
When you're looking under the microscope, just a comparison between the worm leachate and the compost extract, is there many similarities there? Like, is one more abundant than the other?
When I look at the actual vermicompost that the worms are living in, it's generally more diverse than my compost. I think a lot of that has to do with so many more ingredients in it. There's between not only my compost that's in there, it's everything we feed it, between the different grains and food waste. So that is definitely more diverse. And I have used the vermicompost. It's just the kids find it very time consuming to pick every worm out. I need a better system to separate my vermicompost from the worms. So generally when we do that, we dump the toad out and everyone gets on their hands and knees and we pick all the worms out. So that's why I went to using the leachate, which it's a slow process of the water filtrating through the vermicompost. So that liquid that I collect actually has very little life in it. I'll look at it and it'll generally have a little bit of bacteria, but it doesn't have, like a diverse biological component to it. Which, like Derek said, so that's why I don't have to store that aerated. I store that in a sealed barrel, and then use that as the seed dressing.
Okay. One here to either Derek or Joel. Do you find that the system moving forward is quite sustainable the way you're going, or do you feel you're going to have to tweak a few more inputs as you go forward?
Go ahead. You're smarter than me.
Well, it really depends on what you guys are doing. I think it'd be good to give your perspective to that. But I'll answer that maybe in a slightly more generalized way and just add that, I see this debate going on all the time about low input systems and therefore whether or not we are mining the soils. And the kind of the perspective that I have on this is it really comes down to, as I kind of touched on in my early part, is that firstly, don't confuse the fact that when you're looking at your traditional soil tests, you are only measuring those more available fractions, and again, that's only a tiny percentage of what the total is there. So there is certainly many years, in fact many decades, of nutrient reserves present in soils. I've seen a few studies doing the math on FOS, and in some instances it's 100 plus years based on current yields, up to 300 years based on current yields of nutrient supply. In a theoretical point in time in the future, yes, maybe this will become an issue, but that problem is so far away into the future that a much more imminent and urgent problem is the widespread overuse of fertility. We know that many of our inputs have incredibly low nutrient use efficiencies. We have all the problems with phosphorus and nitrogen, entering waterways, etc. The other side of that coin, the nutrient pollution, is a far bigger and immediate problem that I think is the case for really thinking more strongly right now about low input systems. And yeah, maybe down the line in another 100 odd plus years, we can have that more nuanced debate about whether or not we are mining the soils. But it's definitely not a problem in the next many decades, many decades. And the other little nuance of that is that discussion around soil depth. We know that our rooting depth on the way we manage crops in modern times is that modern varieties don't have as bigger root systems as some of our older and more heritage style varieties. So that's the point about soil depth. As you begin to improve soil health and increase the rooting depth, well, then you're also those roots are also traveling down to again scavenge more of those total and locked up minerals that are present in tenfold and etc. amounts. You're then also exploring greater soil volume. So that adds another dimension to the discussion on, well, how long can I use my nutrient reserves? So I kind of, in summary, a long way to say that, sorry, but just my kind of summary point is I think that problem is so far away, it's definitely not the priority to worry about right now, in my perspective.
Yeah. Derek, without the use of like starter P, like starter phosphorus at sowing, do you find that things still get away to do things get away to a slow start without that kick at the start? Or?
And that was, it's interesting. I don't think so, I guess is probably the answer, but I guess I'll back up. That was one of the things we weaned ourselves off fairly slowly. We kind of went from, sort of 10 years ago, we were doing like, 1152, and then we went to sort of an ortho-phos, low salt product. And then we just started doing trials. And I tell people, I learn more. I mean, obviously I learn more from other people, but like as far as applicable things on my farm, doing our own on-farm trials. I mean, everybody's got variable rate seeders and switches to shut things off. And I mean, even if you don't have variable, just shut it off. I mean, I always thought that's a stark contrast. If we can shut these things off, and that's going to tell you a lot. And we just started shutting it off. And, and we started with crops because we know flax is mycorrhizal. So we started with things like that, and we didn't see much of a difference. And understand too, we seed into cold soils. Like when we're seeding, like what's one of the, right, Mom, my biggest number one challenge is this liquid thing that we do isn't salt-based anymore. So we have things freeze solid. So we have to put things inside at night and blow things out, and it's awesome, right? So, we're seeding when it's super cold. So, I mean, with talking about phos availability, right, that's one of our problems is cold, dry soils. I mean, that's worst case scenario, right? And so far so good, and I don't, yeah, I guess if that answers the question, but I don't want people doing cold turkey things. We did enough of that, and I think we had a lot of luck. But eventually we learned to start trialing things, and I think that was a better move for us.
If I could just chime in, one extra point there is that you know, there's a lot of good work looking at the below ground interactions of intercrops as well. And it's very clear that when we bring two different species together, that there's a real synergy that happens between those two different root systems. And there's some studies that have looked specifically at FOS, and we know that, sure, legumes, as an example, they do have slightly more acidic and stronger kind of root exudates. So they are a bit more specialist at solubilizing some of those more difficult to solubilize nutrients like FOS. So there's definitely the evidence there that shows that under the intercropping scenarios, with those two different root systems below ground, that you do get a greater nutrient liberation from some kind of a synergy there between the two, or where the legume is certainly liberating more, which can then deliver that for the other crop. So there are those examples where we do see better phosphorus scavenging under more plant diverse systems as well.
Tanis, do you ever feel that there could be a point where you're putting too much biology with the compost, or do you think it's always going to just balance out?
Like putting too much biology into the soil? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Yes.
My extract isn't that great usually. I always wish it was better. So I'm not too worried about it, especially with what we're putting in, using the local ingredients. It's things that are native to our area. Concerns me a little bit more when, even Derek, something, I mean, there's lots of bugs in a jug, and those, to me, like, a lot of them are one or two species, or very, you know, it's not diverse. And that I always wonder about, putting that much of one species, what that does in a, you know, I think of it as a food web, right? And keeping a balance. So that's where I like to put the diversity of a bunch of different organisms. And if there's too much bacteria, well, then the protozoa will eat them. But I guess what I worry about too much is putting too much of one species into the soil. And that's kind of why we focus on the diversity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Joel or Derek, I guess, for this one. Back at the start, Joel, when you were going through what Derek and Tannis actually put down at sowing with the small rates of micronutrients, I think I noticed there was some going down as a dry granular and some going down dissolved in liquid. Is that right?
The only dry that, oh, probably the Axten should answer this, but the only dry they used was that ammonium sulfate. Then everything else was going down liquid. So maybe what you're referring to there might have been the guano powder, which was, I did express the units of 5 or 6 kgs. So that was a micronized guano powder, which then is still mixed in with the water to form a suspension. So that liquid inject was all liquid. The only dry was that ammonium sulfate.
Okay. Yep. So zinc and boron and so forth is all dissolved liquid.
Correct. Yes.
Sure. Thanks.
What have we got here? Tanis, were you considering the Johnson-Su biochar method of compost at all?
I think it's very intriguing. For us, I don't know how to do it large scale. I know some people played around with it, but our system, you know, we've got a good system. So I've never actually tried it, so I can't honestly comment on it. But I know a lot of people are very happy with the system.
Yeah.
Yep.
Derek, one guy here has noticed that in your soil test, your cation exchange capacity was very high. Is that something that's increasing throughout the journey, or is that just kind of naturally high?
Might be a better Joel question, but I think it's been going up. And you know, sort of back to the question, I was thinking about when Joel was answering about the fertilizer and the mining the soil, is you know, the things that I've seen since we quit using that stuff has been things like, you know, our organic matter's going up, our water infiltration's improving, our structure's improving, our color's getting darker. You know, all those things kind of seem to be happening, and I'm assuming that cation exchange is going with that. Joel, you probably can comment on that.
Yeah, so certainly, obviously, as organic matter increases, that's going to help to hold more moisture, nutrients as well, and increase the CEC. And just more directly to the question, though, I would say that I would cast some hesitation over those CEC figures. They would be a little artificially elevated, just because, as you noticed there, as I mentioned, the soils are very high in calcium. So that extremely high calcium kind of inadvertently pushes the CEC up, the CEC calculation up much higher than perhaps maybe the true moisture and nutrient holding capacity of the soil. So yes, that's a good observation, whoever that was. And yeah, because I think Derek's CECs were coming up at 30, 40, 50, you know, quite heavy, which, based on seeing the soils and having a dig in them as well myself, I wouldn't say they were they're not extreme, they're not those huge, heavy clay soils like you might expect with a 40-odd plus CEC. They were a bit more medium textured than that. So my suspicion is that those CECs are a little elevated just because of there's such a calcium saturation in that soil. Yeah. But still, to the point, you're right, Derek, you know, some of your practices nonetheless are, I'm sure, helping build organic matter, and that is going to be helping to improve the moisture and nutrient holding capacity. Yeah.
Derek, with your intercropping, are you seeing a reduction in your insect pressure through having your intercrops there together?
Yeah, we are. Like we, you know, some of the things that we haven't sprayed an insecticide. Gosh, I don't even know. I used to say, I don't remember how many, a long time. Because I don't know if we've ever sprayed an intercrop, so that's 10 years with an insecticide. And I'm not sure exactly why, but yeah, so far so good. So there's
if I could also just chime in there, that links to, we did have that question earlier about the alternate rows as well, and a little bit on the disease pressure. I'd say in the literature, there's a good body of evidence that highlights that pests and disease especially, but also pests and also weeds, that you do see overall across the board, you do see much lower pest pressures under more diverse systems, and there's good evidence to support that. Now, it's not to say that it's every time and always the case, but I would say there's quite a lot of studies that have looked into that, and that overlaps with the discussion around alternate rows, because and certainly it's true that although there are some benefits to having the diversity all in one row, that closer root to root intermingling, from a disease point of view, certainly the alternate rows is, and this is, I would say this is true from the evidence, but also from what farmers have also told me from their observations, is that it's the alternate rows that really then, you know, begin to physically break up those two species. And that just simply is a dilution effect. And that's the biggest factor that helps with lowering disease pressure. It's that simple dilution effect. Without that monoculture stand, it's monocultures that are opening the door to rapid spread of diseases throughout that crop. You know, all susceptible hosts. As soon as we put 50% non-hosts of that disease in, well, of course, and you know, those disease spores and things might be blowing through the field, but then 50% of the time, you know, they're hitting a non-host, so those spores won't germinate. So it is clear that the alternate rows certainly are better from a pest and disease perspective. It's the physical separation and the dilution effect that is particularly the mode of action there. So. And yeah, I'd say it's a common thing. It's good. It's one of the biggest comments: less pest and disease pressure under the intercropping systems, which is, you know, again, it overlaps to that discussion about low input systems. Okay, I had a focus here on low input fertility, but the evidence is there that it can certainly help to reduce that dependency on pesticides as well. And as evidenced by Derek, your example there of not using an insecticide in the last 10 years or so either. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Tanis, one for you, just with your extracts, do they play a role during the growing season in a foliar sense? Do you apply foliar extract, or indeed foliar nutrition? Does that play a role at all?
We have in the past made compost teas. So basically taking that compost extract and then adding foods to really get the biology active and growing. And then I've applied that as a foliar application. We first did it in 2017, and it's just like anything, your results, we had 0 disease, but we also had 0 rain and 0 disease pressure. So the results of that were kind of, uncertain. And then 2018, we did even more compost tea foliar applications, and we didn't see huge results. I was just looking to hold off some disease because it was a little bit wetter year. We didn't see a huge difference. Derek was looking for a yield bump. We didn't really see that either. So the last couple years now, we haven't done any compost teas. So it's just, and I don't know if a lot of it, like now we're having a wet year, not seeing a lot of disease pressure. I don't know if we're getting enough biology built up in our soil that it's maybe necessary. I'm not sure, because a lot of people have seen great results with the compost teas, but it's a little bit more labor intensive. And of course, doing that foliar application, we were trying to hit before flower and after and maintain it. So it was a little bit more expensive to keep at. So we have went away from that direction, but you never know in the future.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. That's all good. Right, I think we'll wind it all up there as time's sort of up now. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It's been a very informative morning, and I think everyone's gotten a fair bit out of this. So if you enjoyed this webinar, VicNoTill have a few more fantastic webinars on our YouTube channel, which they all can be accessed through our website. I'd like to thank you, Joel, Derek and Tanis, for your time and informative sessions this morning. The presentations have all been fantastic, and we had a lot of great questions come in today, and I hope we've all answered them well. So thank you, Matt, for your help this morning. It was very good. Basically, that's it for me, and thank you all today. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thank you. It was great.
Yep, all the best to your season this year. Yeah.
Hey, same to you. We need all the help we can get.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
Okay,
Right,
thanks very much. Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thanks, Joel.
Okay.